welcome tonight. I'm glad all of you could join us. Hopefully we're just going to have a little commentary this evening from some of our student political leaders here on the Harvard campus, and then we'll get back to the coverage around 8 o'clock. So without any further ado, my name is Eric Christofferson, and I'm chair of the Projects Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Thank you. To my far right, we have Derek Ho, who is the former president of the Harvard-Radcliffe College Democrats. Then we have Andre Cherny, who is the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Political Review. We have Dave DeSimon, who is the vice president of the Harvard Republican Club. And William Zerhouni, who is the president of the Harvard-Radcliffe Republican Alliance.
Thank you. Thank you.
Actually, tonight looms to be a pretty exciting night. We're coming off a pretty exciting caucus in Iowa, where Dole, of course, took 26 of the delegates, Buchanan took 24, and Alexander took 18. And it's funny now that we moved to New Hampshire. New Hampshire is kind of a funny state. It's a state with a population of less than 10% of New York City. And it's kind of funny that such a small state can have such a great significance on the presidential election. Traditionally, New Hampshire has voted, a majority of the voters in New Hampshire in the presidential elections have voted Republican, with the exception of 1992 when there was a large independent voter turnout, of course, the Perot vote. I know basically what I'd like to do tonight is I know here at school a lot of times it's difficult to keep up on current events. It's very easy to fall behind on what's going on and stuff, so hopefully we'll help you out in that regard. And also, I just hope that we can maybe shed a little light on what can be a confusing process at times. So first of all, I'd like to start with a question, and I'd like each of our panelists to give their perspective on each one of the top 4 Republican candidates, just giving a little perspective on what their campaigns have been thus far and what their strategies have been like thus far. So I guess we'll start with William over on the end, and I guess we'll start with Dole, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, before starting, I'd like to urge you not to get out of control because we don't want to call in the security guards for a rowdy audience like this. But off to Bob Dole. I mean, obviously a 72-year-old lawmaker from Kansas, been in Washington for over 35 years, and was basically running his campaign until this point on his resume. I've been tested, I've been tested, I've been tested, is what he loves to tell the American people. And when the competition wasn't fierce, apparently that was working. But now that people have begun to nip at Bob Dole's heels, especially with Steve Forbes and his attack ads, that's been falling apart. People tend to think, I mean, or at least the way I see it, that Bob Dole doesn't have a certain vision for America, that the only reason he wants to be president is because he thinks he deserves it. Apparently with Republican primary voters, that's not really going to work. And I think that's why we're seeing Bob Dole slip, because his support was basically a mile wide and an inch deep. And now you're seeing that go over to other candidates. So,
great. Dave?
If we'd like to comment a bit on Bob Dole's strategy in the primary elections, I think that he tried to definitely look at the past 40-odd years that he's been in politics, both in Washington and in Kansas. What Bob Dole offers the public and what he keeps ringing in the ears of the American people through his advertisements on television, and CNN just reported that he had just this past week just this past day, over 600 odd commercials to Steve Forbes' 500 ads. But what he's trying to show to the American public is that he's a candidate of character. He served valiantly in the Second World War. He's a decent American, and he has a healthy suspicion of big government. It seems that Bob Dole hasn't been entirely successful, though, thus far. He's definitely fallen back. At the beginning of the race, it was Bob Dole and Phil Gramm. We no longer have Phil Gramm in the race, but we have a Bob Dole who has no lead whatsoever. So it seems that Bob Dole, though once an extremely strong candidate who seemed to have very little opposition, has found himself in a melee and somewhat of a fierce struggle for the nomination.
Great, thanks. Andre?
I think what both gentlemen say is absolutely correct. What strikes me as the best analogy to what's going on in 1996 is really, if you look back at the 1984 Democratic race, where you had an experienced, tested leader of the party, in that case was Walter Mondale, whose support was also a mile wide and an inch deep, it turned out, and who went on to win with the Iowa caucuses by almost 50%, but the candidacy of Gary Hart really showed the great weakness of Walter Mondale's candidacy, and Gary Hart battled Walter Mondale all the way to the convention. Walter Mondale eventually won that race. The difference, though, in this case is that whereas Gary Hart came from a wing of the party that wanted to move away from its traditions in at least some ways, especially on the social matters, Pat Buchanan wants to move the party closer to where its base lies, and that is the right. In addition, what really helped Walter Mondale in the end was the work of the unions, which helped him get out his votes and helped him make the necessary moves to, in fact, get the nomination. What the analogous part of the unions is in the Republican Party is the Christian Coalition, and that is strongly behind Pat Buchanan. So Bob Dole is going into New Hampshire as a very weak candidate. He really is running as for the race of Prime Minister of the United States, and the presidency is really a very different question, a very different office. What we want is really a democratically elected king, and Bob Dole seems just constitutionally incapable of trying to step into that role. It's his third time in the third time in the race for the presidency, and he still does not seem to have grasped that central fact.
Thanks. Derek?
I agree with everything that all three gentlemen have said. I would only add this, that essentially America elects a president of the United States with very specific leadership qualities, with someone with a vision, someone with something more of a rigid ideology than Bob Dole seems to have. The leadership that Bob Dole would bring to the White House is the leadership of a technician, the leadership of a legislator who makes deals in back rooms, who compromises when compromise has to be made, and that really isn't the type of leadership that especially the Republican Party is looking for. The Republican Party is looking for someone who won't moderate his issues to the political wind, who will stay true to his ideals, and I think that's why so many Republicans are leaning towards Pat Buchanan, because Pat Buchanan on his face has the image of someone who really does not want to yield on anything.
Great, thank you. Just in the, for time's sake, I'd like to move on, maybe do two of them at a time, and start with Derek. Just briefly, you just mentioned Buchanan at the end of your the comments, so if you could maybe start with Buchanan and Alexander as well.
Sure. Pat Buchanan, as everyone knows, is a former commentator. He is the most conservative of all the candidates in this, or all the front runners in this race. He has a very limited base of support. His base of support is essentially the far right of the Republican Party, but that faction is growing bigger and bigger with every election, and his support amongst those people is very, very strong. About of the people that were polled in Iowa, I think about 68% of the people that voted for him said that their support was very strong, and that's unusual among the other candidates. Quite frankly, I think a vote for Pat Buchanan is a vote for President Clinton. He is too far right to be elected by the general populace. He is just hanging on among the Republican electorate. If he goes very far, I think the Republican Party is in trouble.
Andre?
I would agree with that, but with this caveat. I mean, I think that Pat Buchanan is really by far the most interesting character in this race, probably one of the most interesting people we've had in American politics to come along in years. He matches a far-right rhetoric on social issues with a rhetoric that is really to the left of Bill Clinton on economic issues. He's really the one New Deal liberal on economic issues that's running in this race, ironically. He goes out and attacks the corporations and so forth. What's interesting, I would agree with Derek, but I'm reminded of a little story. Once upon a time, there was a far-right candidate who challenged the incumbent Republican president in the primaries. The incumbent Republican president went on to win the primaries, but went on to lose the general election to a Southern governor. And 4 years later, that far-right candidate was again running in the primaries, and the Carter White House was gleefully smacking their lips and clapping and hoping and praying that the Republicans would be dumb enough to nominate Ronald Reagan for the presidency. So I think that we shouldn't be so sure that Pat Buchanan is so totally unelectable, even though the polls at this point would indicate that he is. As for Lamar Alexander, I think that he has the one potential greatest among their entire Republican field to actually beat President Clinton. And he really wears well for all his gimmicks about walking across the state and wearing the plaid shirts and having the big mud boots and so on. I think that people really see that he is a likable guy and is not a bomb thrower like the other candidates often appear to be.
Dave?
I think that Patrick Buchanan, while advocating some of the vital conservative messages like the right to life, restraints on immigration, judicial sanity, and an end to racial quotas, he's forged an agenda which is increasingly at odds with the ideologies of many conservatives. He supports a foreign policy which would retreat from America's responsibilities, and he supports a trade policy which would effectually increase attacks on American consumers through higher tariffs. His populism has moved him steadily closer to the left, to such a point that he echoes the Democratic attack on GOP Medicare reforms. Pat Buchanan has not made the message that rings well with conservatives the centerpiece of his candidacy. Instead, he's made the centerpiece his opposition to free trade and the opposition to immigration. I think that is essentially what hurts Pat Buchanan. He has a message otherwise that's very Reagan-esque. It rings back to a type of conservatism that Ronald Reagan would have supported, but he simply hasn't focused on those parts of his agenda, and I think that would be his ruin. If we'd like to talk a bit about Lamar Alexander, we can say that he has portrayed himself as the only candidate who can beat Clinton. If this is true or not, I'm not sure. But Lamar Alexander, as a conservative, doesn't have a very long track record. He seems to be conservative in view, but I'm not sure how durable that conservatism will prove to be.
Will?
Okay, well, basically, if there's any one person that Patrick Buchanan reminds me of in running his campaign this year, it's George Wallace in 1972. And they're going after the very same voters. The blue-collar voters who feel very ill at ease with their position in society and feel that somebody else is going to take their piece of the pie. In 1972, that somebody else were black Americans, African Americans. In 1996, that somebody else is Mexican Americans, immigrants, Hispanics, and the like. And obviously, you've seen Pat Buchanan play to those fears. Play not only to fears of economic instability by opposing NAFTA and so on, but play to a lot of nativist and xenophobic fears by opposing legal immigration, not just illegal immigration, and other such things. His words, bear him out more than I could ever do here tonight. And for those reasons, Pat Buchanan seems very extreme, and not, just like, he doesn't seem necessarily far right, but also mixes a lot of liberal economic issues with a hardcore social conservatism. And I think that's why the Clinton White House is basically licking their lips, waiting for their chance at Pat Buchanan, because they basically think that they can't lose one single state to Pat Buchanan. So they're hoping for a strong Buchanan showing tonight. The guy they are not hoping to see do well is Lamar Alexander. In fact, last week after the Iowa caucuses, the White House was spreading basically rumors and innuendos about Lamar Alexander's financial history and so on, because apparently people in the White House are very worried that if Lamar Alexander does well and gets out of the primaries as the Republican nominee, that he could basically stick it to Clinton in the South, where both were very progressive Southern governors, and where Lamar Alexander sounds very reasonable. If, after all, Dave is right, Lamar Alexander doesn't have hardcore conservative credentials, and that may end up hurting him in the primary. But in the general election, that is basically what leads up to his whole ABCs, if you want. Alexander beats Clinton, as he says. So Lamar Alexander is positioning himself as the most electable of the Republican candidates, a guy who wants to shift power back to communities and to states. And so far, it's working. With his positive ads and his positive campaign and the backlash against Steve Forbes and the whole negative advertisements in the campaigns, Lamar Alexander is basically finding his niche in this primary season. So that's what we're looking at for those two gentlemen.
We'd like to keep the comments maybe towards the end when we get finished, but thank you for your interest.
We don't necessarily.
Right, of course. Yeah, so I guess now, just really quickly, I'd like to turn to the tax man, Steve Forbes, and just quickly give us your perspectives on that. Will?
Well, basically, Steve Forbes was running he was Johnny One Note for about 2-3 months here. Flat tax, flat tax, flat tax. And not only that, he had millions of dollars to back him up, and he spent it. However, I think people got very turned off when he went after Dole a little bit too aggressively. I think he kind of lost his head in Iowa, to tell you the truth, attacking the Christian coalition and saying that the Christian coalition was out to get him. And that's not the smartest thing when Iowa voters tend to be, or a lot of Iowa voters tend to be religious conservatives and part of the Christian coalition, and I think they turned against him. And seeing that, he lost his momentum going into New Hampshire. I think he will continue to lose momentum, and he says he's going to stay in the game no matter what. He calls this the second inning in a game that's going to go into extra innings. We'll see if that happens, but I think that we have seen the extent that money can go in politics when you couple it with one-issue campaign and negative ads.
Dave?
I would agree. I think that Steve Forbes simply does have that one issue, and he sees the flat tax and tax reform in general as a type of panacea that might cure all of America's woes. It doesn't seem to me that there's a necessary correlation between cutting taxes and a moral or spiritual rebirth in America, and that's what Steve Forbes is trying to make the connection between. I don't think he's going to be extremely successful in tonight's primary. He'll probably come in fourth. But he certainly has made great strides from a point where few knew him outside of the economic community. He's always been a very successful prognosticator of the economy, but otherwise he had very little recognition in the political world. So it's very interesting to see what a few $1 million will do for a candidate.
Andre?
It seems like a few $1 million do an awful lot, because Steve Forbes bought his way into the contention of the Republican primary, bought his way onto the cover of 2 major news magazines in the same week. And if this primary had been held 2 weeks ago, he could have bought himself the Republican nomination. I think what this really calls out as far as campaign finance reform, the amazing amount of money that Steve Forbes spent is really grotesque. If you look at it, there's something called rating points, which is the amount of commercials that are on TV. For the average week, a huge advertiser like Coca-Cola or Budweiser or something like that is going to have about 1,000 rating points, which means the average person is going to see the commercial about 10, 11 times. About a month and a half before the Republican primary in New Hampshire, Steve Forbes had, for New Hampshire viewers, 5,000 rating points. The average viewer was seeing commercials for Steve Forbes 50 to 53, 54 times. That's unbelievable, and that says there's something wrong in our democracy when a person can do something like that. And I would hope that this would make the Republicans in the field take a second look at campaign finance reform once this whole process is over.
One quick question for Andre before we go on. Sorry, Derek. But don't you think that this campaign would have eventually proved the opposite point? That somebody came in, tried to buy his way into the primaries, and the American voters were just too smart for that. And then in the end, they rejected it.
No, I think that is the ultimate thing. But what would happen if New Hampshire primary had been, 2 weeks ago, when Steve Forbes was leading the race? It just happens that he peaked too early.
Do you think that that's because he had so much money, or because Dole was in such a weak position? I don't know.
Yes, I think obviously that if he hadn't had the opening, then he wouldn't have been able to step through the door. But the fact still remains that he was able to get into contention based on really his campaign finance reform and based on his campaign spending. And what knocked him out of contention was the negative ads that he ran with all that money, and the negative ads that run against him, which just spent even more money. So in a field where there perhaps wouldn't have been such other wealthy candidates like Senator Dole, who was willing to make the necessary buys to knock Steve Forbes out of the race, I'm not sure that we would have had a very different campaign going on today.
I don't agree, but interesting.
All right. It's an interesting debate. We'll have to save campaign finance reform for another forum. But Derek, please.
I have nothing to say. I think he bought his way into the campaign. I think his message was so thin that people saw through him in 2 weeks. I agree that his timing was also bad. Otherwise, he might have won 1 or 2, maybe Iowa and maybe New Hampshire. But I think people would have seen through him regardless, and any momentum that he would have had would have evaporated.
Great. Just quickly, so we can just maybe if we could just get your quick predictions on what's going to happen tonight, the outcome that we should be finding out about shortly.
I think Dole is going to pull off a squeaker. I think Buchanan is going to come in second, a couple points behind, and Alexander a couple points behind him. However, Dole is expected to win here. The stakes are highest for him. If he doesn't win, I think he's in pretty serious trouble. But even if he does win by a couple points, the real winners in this New Hampshire primary are bound to be Buchanan and Alexander.
Andre?
Well, I'll say that I made a prediction a few days ago, and I'm going to stick by my man. And that prediction was, and we'll see if it comes through, Buchanan, Alexander, Dole, with Forbes way back pulling up the rear.
All right, Dave.
I would have to say that I agree with Derek. I think it's going to be Dole, Buchanan, then Alexander, and Forbes in a far fourth. But if Buchanan is able to beat Dole, I don't think that will mean the end of the Dole campaign. Yet if Alexander is able to beat Dole and Buchanan, then that may have some very serious implications for the further progress of Senator Dole.
Well, I think the real race tonight here is between Dole and Alexander, because no matter how well Patrick Buchanan does, the party elite is going to oppose him, and they're going to put a firewall around him and make sure that somebody else gets the nomination. I do think that tonight we're going to see good things for Patrick Buchanan, because I think his poll numbers have been a bit depressed because nobody wants to go out there and admit they're going to vote for Patrick Buchanan. And I think that he's going to do better than expected. I also think there is a mischievous independent vote that may be working, where Democratic-leaning independents may go in and want to vote for Buchanan to help out Clinton in the end. I also think we're going to see good things for Lamar Alexander. There were up to 11% undecided voters yesterday. The majority of those were women. In Iowa, the undecideds broke decidedly for Alexander. And women tend to break for Alexander over Dole and Buchanan. So I definitely think those two men are going to do very well tonight. I think that Dole is going to lose the expectations game. I think he's going to head to the South very wounded. What I would expect tonight is that Buchanan will, and I'll let my bias out here, unfortunately win. And I think Dole and Alexander will be tied for a very close second.
All right. We only have a few minutes left, so I'll turn to one last question. We just saw that, in a shocker, Clinton won the primary in New Hampshire. So basically, I think a lot of people are interested in what does this all mean for Clinton? How has he used his incumbency? Has he used it effectively? Has it helped him at all? And basically, where do we go from here? So, Will.
I've been pretty surprised to see Bill Clinton not try to use the Rose Garden strategy, which George Bush held on to for a bit too long in '92. That said, however, I think Bill Clinton is in a very strong position, much stronger than George Bush was in 1992, having no primary opposition, and the Democratic Party basically coalescing around him as an opposition to Gingrich and to Dole and to the Republican Congress. I think he's very strong, yet I don't think he's invincible. I think if you look at polls right now and say that you think that Clinton's going to win, I would urge you to remember back in 1988 when Dukakis was beating Bush by 17% in springtime and summertime polls and ended up losing in a landslide to George Bush. So I don't think the fat lady's out on the stage yet. I don't think she's even rehearsing, but I think Bill Clinton looks really strong.
Thank you. Dave.
I agree. We can't underestimate Bill Clinton because he's an extremely savvy politician. He knows precisely what the people want to hear and which message to bring to them. Right now, it's a conservative message, essentially, that he's putting out, as evidenced by his State of the Union address. I don't think, though, as Will said, he is invincible. Absolutely not. He certainly can be beaten. And I would also like to point out that the American public has an extremely short-term memory. They will quite easily forget that there was such a divide within the Republican Party between Pat Buchanan and Dole and Alexander. And I think that the election in November will come down to issues. And I hope that the Republican Party can effectively bring to light precisely what Bill Clinton stands for. And that's not a conservative message that he would like us to believe.
Thank you. Andre.
I think that the New Hampshire primary is a big story for Bill Clinton because, as was mentioned, he doesn't have an opponent. He's the first Democrat since Franklin Roosevelt running for re-election to not have a primary opponent. And if you'll remember, Franklin Roosevelt was the last Democrat who was re-elected as president. So I think that augurs well for him. I would say that I think that going into this, he really does have the issues on his side. I think that people have been turned off by what the Republicans have done in Congress for the past year and a half. And I think that what is necessary now is for him to articulate a message, a positive message, that'll carry him through November. I think that he started to do that in the State of the Union address. I think that he needs to continue on these new Democratic themes. And I think really the tide of issues are on his side. And I think that he'll be successful if he keeps on down that road.
Thank you. Derek?
I essentially agree with Andre. I disagree with Dave that the New Hampshire primary and the current divide within the Republican Party is not going to be remembered by people in November. Perhaps they won't remember the New Hampshire primary per se, but we have to remember that what we're doing here is carving up delegates for the convention. And if you remember last convention, all of the splintering that occurred during the entire primary season was basically repeated in full on national TV in July or August or whenever the convention was. The Republican Party is eating its young in front of the nation, and I really do think that is going to have its consequences when Pat Buchanan takes the stage with a whole host of delegates at the convention and gives the speech that we all know he can and will give.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I guess that's all we have time for.
I think the woman in the overcoat.
Yeah, we'll have one question. Quickly, please. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We don't have any more time. I'm sorry about that.
Let me just respond to that really quickly. I mean, I respect your opinion. I just have to disagree with you here. I tend to do think that what Patrick Buchanan is pitching himself at is a lot of the insecurities that a lot of workers face. I mean, to tell you the truth, Lamar Alexander may not be very in touch with the working man, and I would respectfully concede. But I would also have to say that Patrick Buchanan himself is no working man model either. I mean, for crying out loud, this is a guy who's a millionaire who's been on Crossfire and CNN, and I really don't think he's been in the factories along with the blue collar voters. But I do think that he's tapping into a lot of their sentiments, and I think that you're right that people overlook that at their peril, and that there could be a very negative backlash if they do. And I agree with you on that point. Disagree with you on the analysis of Patrick Buchanan.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. That's all we have time for. I hope all of you will get involved with this campaign as it goes on down the road, and definitely I hope you all can get out there and vote when it comes time in November, no matter what the candidate is that you vote for. Thanks very much.